"Ma'am, are you sure you don't need me to call someone? The road's about to flood." The woman in the truck just stared at her, eyes red, jaw set, one hand gripping the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing left in the world. "I need to get to Meridian by sunup. I promised my father I'd be standing at his grave on the anniversary. I've never missed it. I am not missing it tonight." Sergeant Toya Mercer, 28, looked at the woman's truck, a 2007 Chevy Silverado, hood up, steam rising into the Mississippi dark, and then at the foreclosure notice she'd been staring at on her kitchen table before she heard the engine seize up outside. 42 days, that's what she had left. 42 days before the bank took the house her grandfather built with his own hands in 1958. She looked back at the stranger. Then she wiped her hands on her cargo pants and said what her grandfather always said. "You came to the right place." 3 weeks later, 47 women in military dress uniform would be standing in her front yard at sunrise, and nobody in Clover Bend, Mississippi, was ready for what the woman in that truck turned out to be. But first, let me take you back to where this began. Toya Mercer had been home 11 months when the truck pulled up. 11 months since her last deployment. 11 months of waking up at 0400. Because her body didn't know how to stop. She'd done 2 tours in the Army. Military police. Then hand-selected for a logistics and security detail that she still couldn't talk about in full. And she'd come home to Clover Bend, Mississippi, population just under 2,000, because her grandfather had a stroke and there was nobody else. The town was a comma on the map between 2 larger towns that didn't care it existed. Her grandfather, Horace Mercer, had built the house himself in the summer of 1958 when banks in that county wouldn't give a black man a construction loan. He poured the foundation with 2 friends and a borrowed mixer. He ran the electrical himself, watching library books spread on the floor of a half-finished room, reading until he understood. The house was his argument with the world. It said, "I built this." It said, "I'm still here." Horace had his stroke in February. He was alive, barely, in a rehab facility in Jackson. The bills were splitting the family in half. Toya's uncle thought they should sell. Toya's mother, who lived in Memphis, thought they should sell. Toya was the only one who stayed. She was also the only one not asking the house to give up yet. She worked 3 jobs. Night dispatcher for a private security firm, Monday through Thursday. Weekend shifts stocking shelves at the Feed and Grain outside of town, and Saturdays she fixed things. That was the thing nobody in Clover Bend knew, not fully, about Toya Mercer. In the Army, when something broke and parts were 6 days out and the mission was tomorrow, Toya was the one they sent for. She had a gift: mechanical, structural, electrical. Her CO had called it a calling. Her bunkmate had called it witchcraft. Her grandfather, who'd taught her to read a wiring diagram before she could read a chapter book, had called it family. Every Saturday, she opened the side door of Horace's detached workshop, and she fixed things for people who couldn't afford to go anywhere else. She didn't advertise. She didn't charge what it was worth. She charged what people had, and when people had nothing, she charged them coffee and a story. The workshop had a handmade sign above the door that Horace had put up sometime in the 90s. It said, simply, "Mercer Works." The paint was faded now. The wood was going soft at the corners, but it was still there. The bank's 42-day notice was not the first. It was the third. The first had arrived when Horace's hospital bills hit $90,000. Toya had negotiated them down, fought with billing, applied for every assistance program she could find, and pulled a 3rd job. She had bought them 7 months. The second notice came when the HVAC failed, and the repair cost what she didn't have. She'd fixed the unit herself, watching videos on a cracked tablet in the workshop at midnight. She bought them 4 more months. The 3rd notice was harder to fight. It was math now, not will. She was short $31,000 and counting, and she had 42 days. She hadn't told Horace. Every Sunday she drove to Jackson and sat beside him and held his hand and told him the azaleas were doing well and the workshop was busy and everything was fine. She had been lying to her grandfather for 11 months, and it was the hardest thing she had ever done, including 2 combat deployments. That Thursday evening in early April, a storm was rolling up from the Gulf. The weather radio said possible flooding on the lower roads by midnight. Toya was in the workshop at 7 p.m., finishing up an alternator swap on a neighbor's sedan, the radio on low, the overhead light flickering in the wind. She heard the truck before she saw it. That particular engine sound, a Silverado with a cracked coolant line and a thermostat that had finally given up. She could identify it the way a doctor identifies a cough. She stepped out into the gravel lot just as the truck coasted to a stop at the end of the driveway, steam pouring from under the hood in the yellow porch light. The driver's door opened. A woman stepped out, mid-60s, white, silver hair pulled back tight. She was wearing slacks and a quilted vest, the kind of clothes that cost more than they looked like they cost. She walked to the hood with her hands on her hips, looked at the steam, and said something under her breath that Toya couldn't hear but understood perfectly. Toya crossed the gravel. "Ma'am, you need help?" The woman looked up. Her eyes were dry, but just barely. She had the look of a person who had decided, some years ago, that she was not going to cry in front of strangers, and was holding to that decision by force of will. "My truck died. I need to get to Meridian by sunrise. It's 4 hours north." She paused. "My father passed last April. I promised him at the graveside I would come back every year on the anniversary. This is the first year. I've been planning it for 12 months. Toya looked at the truck. Then she looked at the sky. Then she looked back at the woman. She stepped forward, lifted the hood the rest of the way, pulled her flashlight from her back pocket, and started looking. 2 minutes later, she came back around to the driver's side. "The coolant line blew. Your thermostat's gone with it. The radiator cap pressure seal is shot. That's why it escalated fast." She looked at the woman straight. "I can fix it, but not with store parts. Everything's closed and the roads south are already flooding." She paused. "I'd have to fabricate a temp line and pull a cap from a donor vehicle I've got out back. It'll hold you to Meridian and back, but you'll want it properly replaced after." The woman's face went very still. "Can you do that tonight?" Toya nodded once. The woman exhaled. She reached into the vest pocket and pulled out a money clip. "How much?" Toya shook her head. "We'll talk about that after it's running. Come inside, out of the rain." She gestured toward the workshop door. "My name is Toya." The woman extended her hand. "Patricia Vance." Toya went still on the inside. She didn't let it show. She shook the hand and said, "Nice to meet you, ma'am," and turned back to the truck. She had heard that name before. Everyone in Mississippi had heard that name before, but she wasn't certain, and she wasn't going to build anything on uncertain. The next 5 hours were the closest Toya had felt to herself since she'd come home. 7:22 p.m. She pulled the blown coolant hose, assessed the thermostat housing. Cracked at the neck. Not just the thermostat, the housing itself. She went to the back corner of the workshop where Horace kept a wall of labeled bins, a system the man had built over 40 years of refuse, nothing philosophy. She found a compatible housing in a bin labeled 2004-2010 GM485.3. Of course he had one. She laughed once, short to the empty workshop. 7:58 p.m. The donor cap was a match. She pressure tested it on the bench. Good seal. 8:30 p.m. The woman named Patricia sat on a folding chair near the workbench and watched without speaking. She had accepted a cup of coffee from the kitchen. Toya's grandmother's thermos, the green plaid one, still sitting on the shelf where it had been since 1994. And she held it in both hands and did not take her eyes off Toya's work. After a while, she said, "How long have you been doing this?" "Since I was 7. My grandfather taught me." "She's a mechanic?" He was. Is. He's in rehab right now. Stroke. Toya kept her eyes on the housing. "This is his shop." Patricia was quiet. Then, "How long has this shop been here?" Toya looked up at the sign above the door. "Since about 1974. He built it himself." Patricia set the coffee down on the bench. She said nothing for a while. Then she reached into her vest pocket, pulled out a small leather notebook. Worn, the clasp bent from years of use, and wrote something down slowly. She put it back without explaining. 9:45 p.m. Power flickered twice. Third time it cut. Toya had the battery lantern hung from the rafter hook before the darkness fully settled. She'd done this before. In worse conditions, she kept working. 10:17 p.m. The housing seated clean. She torqued the bolts in the cross pattern, the way Horace had drilled into her so many times she could do it dreaming. 10:52 p.m. She bled the system, checked for air pockets, ran a cold start idle test, with the lantern held close to watch for leaks. The temperature gauge climbed, held, stabilized. She stood up. She wiped her hands. "Start it for me, ma'am." Patricia got behind the wheel. She turned the key. The engine caught on the first try. No steam, no knock, just the low, even idle of an engine that had been fixed properly. She sat there a moment with her hands on the wheel and her eyes closed. Then she stepped out. She looked at Toya. Her voice was quieter than it had been all evening. "What do I owe you?" Toya named a figure. $60 for the housing, $10 for the cap, $40 for the labor. $110 total. Patricia stared at her. "I would have paid $500 and felt I'd gotten a bargain." She reached into the money clip and held out 5 bills. Toya looked at them. Then she looked at Patricia. "What I said stands, ma'am. 110. The older woman's face shifted. Something moved behind her eyes, quick and unreadable. "Take the rest for your grandfather's shop." Toya's jaw tightened. She'd said too much, mentioned too much. She took a slow breath. "That's kind of you. But what's honest is what you owe." She took 3 of the bills and handed 2 back. Patricia stared at her for a long moment. Then she folded the 2 bills and slipped them back into the clip without another word. She went to the workbench and laid down 100 and a 10 side by side. Then she reached into her vest pocket again. Not the notebook this time. A business card. Plain cream stock, no logo, just a name and a handwritten phone number. "If you ever need anything," she said, "you call that number directly. Not the main line. That one." She tapped it once. "Tell them Patricia sent you. They'll know what it means." Toya took the card. She looked at it. No title, no company. Just a name she recognized and a number she didn't. Patricia picked up her bag and walked to the truck. She stopped at the door. "Your grandfather's sign up there. Mercer Works." She looked at it a moment. "It means something, that sign. Don't let anyone take it down." Then she got in the truck and pulled out into the wet dark of Route 9, taillights disappearing around the tree line. Toya stood in the workshop door, holding a business card in a hand that smelled like coolant and old coffee. She looked at the name on the card for a long time. Patricia Vance. She knew who Patricia Vance was. Anyone who'd followed Mississippi politics or state infrastructure for the past 20 years knew who Patricia Vance was. The woman had spent a decade and a half running the Vance Rural Development Foundation, one of the largest private charitable organizations operating in the Deep South. Before that, she'd been a state legislator. Before that, the youngest woman ever to serve as county commissioner in Rankin County. She'd been on the cover of 3 magazines. She'd turned down a Senate appointment in 2019 because, she'd said in the interview Toya had read, she could do more good outside of it. But that couldn't be right. People like that didn't break down on Route 9 in the rain. Toya went inside. She set the card on the kitchen table face down. She did not tell herself what she was hoping. Her grandfather had taught her not to build castles on clouds. After the first notice from the bank, she'd spent a week believing a cousin who swore he could get investors interested in the property. That had cost her $400 in legal prep fees and a month of sleep. She had learned. She turned the card back over and looked at it once more. Then she put it in the drawer under the telephone. She did not sleep well for 9 days. On the 3rd day after the repair, she typed the name into the search bar on her laptop. What came back confirmed what she already half knew. Foundation endowment. $340 million. Active grants in 22 Mississippi counties. A flagship program called the Roots Initiative, designed specifically to acquire and preserve Black-owned land and family properties facing tax foreclosure or bank acquisition. Toya closed the laptop. She sat in Horace's kitchen for a long time, looking at the linoleum floor that he'd laid himself in 1971. She didn't allow herself to do anything with that information. She'd been trained to wait, to gather, to not act on incomplete intelligence. She was very good at it in the field. She was less good at it in a kitchen in Clover Bend, staring at a drawer she'd already opened twice. On the 6th day, a man named Dale Hubbard from Cornerstone Property Solutions pulled up in a white Escalade and knocked on the door. He smiled the way people smile when they've already decided they've won. 42 days, Ms. Mercer. I want you to know we're prepared to make this easy for you. He held out a folder. $85,000. Cash offer, close in 15 days. You keep the personal property, we handle the paperwork. Toya looked at the folder. She looked at the man. This house is assessed at $240. He smiled again. It's assessed at what the bank says it's worth in a market that's moved on. I'm offering what it'll move for in this zip code, in this economy, to a buyer who isn't interested in waiting. She closed the door. He stood on the porch an extra 10 seconds before she heard his footsteps go back down the steps. That night, she went to the workshop alone and sat on Horace's stool, the old one with the cracked vinyl seat that he'd never replaced because he said it fit him perfectly wrong. She looked at her grandfather's tools, the wall of labeled bins, the workbench he'd built from a door and 2 sawhorses in 1982. Above the bench, the framed photograph. Horace, in 1969, 26 years old, standing in front of this exact workshop when the walls were still raw wood, grinning like a man who had just told the world something it wasn't going to forget. She thought about the card in the drawer. She went and got it. She didn't call that night. She went back to the workshop and sat with it in her hand until she figured out what she was really feeling. It wasn't hope, exactly. It was the same feeling she'd had twice in the field. That specific alertness that preceded something that would change everything, good or bad, and the only right response was to stay still and be ready. She called on the morning of the 8th day. The line rang twice. A woman answered, warm and professional. Patricia sent me. My name is Toya Mercer. I'm calling from Clover Bend. A pause. Very brief. Ms. Mercer, we've been expecting your call. Can you hold one moment? Toya sat down. What happened on the 9th day she did not fully understand until the morning of the 10th. She was in the workshop at 5:50 a.m. early because she hadn't slept when she heard it. Not a truck engine. Something lower, more distributed. A sound that moved through the floorboards before it reached her ears. She went to the window. Route 9 was full. Not traffic, not a convoy. Something else. A long, organized procession of vehicles, SUVs, trucks, a coach bus, 2 vans with foundation logos on the side, turning into the road that led to the Mercer property. They filled the gravel, the side field, the shoulder for a quarter mile. Toya stood very still. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number, she answered. Ms. Mercer. This is Patricia. I hope we're not too early. There are some things we'd like to discuss with you this morning, if you're willing. We're in the drive. Toya looked out the window at 47 women in military dress uniform, standing in her grandfather's front yard in the breaking light. She had to hold the window frame for a moment. She walked to the front door and opened it. Patricia Vance was standing on the porch, clean and composed, wearing a charcoal blazer over a white blouse. Behind her, the 47 women, veterans, realized, reading the unit patches, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, some from wars before Toya was born, stood in formation. Hands folded, faces forward, helmets off. Patricia said, "May we come in?" Toya stepped back and let them in. 2 women carried leather portfolios. The rest remained outside in formation, motionless. As patient as people who had learned patience in places where impatience cost lives. Patricia stood in Horace's kitchen and took off her jacket and laid it over the back of the chair, the way someone does when they intend to stay a while. She looked at Toya directly. "I want to tell you something I haven't spoken out loud in many years." Toya waited. 22 years ago, I was a first-term county commissioner trying to pass a rural infrastructure bill that every man in that chamber thought was decorative. I was going to lose the vote. I knew it the night before. I went for a drive. I used to do that. Long drives on two-lane roads when I needed to think. My car blew a fuse, then the alternator went, out on a county road south of here, 2 in the morning, no cell signal worth a thing. She stopped. Toya watched her. An older black man pulled over. He'd been driving home from a late shift somewhere. He had the right tools in his truck bed. He fixed my alternator right there on the shoulder of a county road in the dark, would not take money. Told me his name, told me he believed in what I was trying to do, told me he'd read about the bill in the local paper. He shook my hand and drove away before I could do anything. Patricia's voice was steady, but her hands, flat on the kitchen table, were pressing down in a way that meant they would not be steady if she let them lift. I asked around the next day. Found out his name. Horace Mercer. Clover Bend. The man fixed cars for people who couldn't afford the shop rate. He'd built his place himself. Everybody in 2 counties knew him. Toya's chest went tight. "I passed that bill by 1 vote, Patricia said. I've always believed that night had something to do with how I showed up in that chamber the next morning." She looked at the workshop through the kitchen window. "I tried to find him afterward, to thank him properly. But life moved fast that year, and then faster, and then I heard he'd had a stroke and was in care." She stopped. "A few nights ago, his granddaughter fixed my truck. Same way he fixed my car. Wouldn't take the full payment. Gave me exactly what was honest and not $1 more." She looked at Toya. "I knew before you told me your last name. I knew from the way you worked." Toya was not going to cry. She was not built for crying in front of people. But her grandfather's framed photograph was right there on the workshop wall, and she could see it through the window from where she stood, and something in her chest was cracking along a seam she hadn't known was there. Patricia nodded to one of the women with a portfolio. The portfolio opened on the kitchen table. Documents, real ones, already signed on one side. The first page was the deed to the Mercer property. Free and clear. The Vance Foundation had satisfied the outstanding mortgage and all associated penalties, $31,000 even, on the day after Patricia's call. The property was Horace's outright. Toya sat down. The second document was a facilities grant. The Vance Foundation's Roots Initiative would fund a full renovation of Mercer Works, structural repairs, new equipment, updated electrical, proper ventilation, 4 service bays, a parts inventory system. Horace's original workbench, his wall of bins, the photograph, the green plaid thermos, those stayed. Under glass, at the entrance, a brass plaque beside them, reading, "This is where it started, and where it starts again." The third document was a scholarship letter. Full tuition, room and board, textbooks, and a monthly stipend to Mississippi State's mechanical engineering program, beginning fall semester. 4 years. Toya stared at her own name on the letterhead. She'd wanted to study engineering since she was 9 years old. She'd wanted it so much that wanting it had started to hurt by the time she was 15. Because she could see by then that wanting it didn't make it reachable. She'd gone into the Army instead, because the Army was real and engineering school was $180,000, and no one in the Mercer family had $180,000. She'd told herself the Army was what she chose. She'd been good enough at telling herself that to almost believe it. The scholarship had a 4th-year stipend specifically for a senior project. The suggested use, written in Patricia's own handwriting in the margin. The history of Mercer Works as an architectural and community resource study. Toya covered her mouth. Patricia pulled the last document forward. The Vance Foundation's Veterans in Trades Fellowship, a 2-year-old program placing female veterans in skilled trade apprenticeships across the South, was being reorganized. Effective this month, it would be renamed the Horace and Toya Mercer Fellowship, endowed at $2.1 million. The mission: to train and place Black women veterans in mechanical, electrical, and construction trades in rural communities. Toya would hold a permanent advisory seat from the day she graduated. Patricia looked at her directly. "Your grandfather fixed my car 22 years ago and wouldn't let me pay him what it was worth. You did the same thing 9 days ago." She paused. The interest on a debt like that has a way of accumulating. Toya was crying. She didn't decide to. She just was. The kind of crying that doesn't make much sound because the person doing it has spent years learning to hold everything inside. And suddenly the holding fails. Patricia did not look away. She did not offer a tissue or fill the silence with noise. She just let it be. After a moment, she reached across the table and put her hand over Toya's. "Your grandfather built something in 1958 that the world didn't make easy to build. You've been holding it together with your bare hands." She squeezed once. "That is done now. You can put it down." Outside, the 47 veterans still stood in Horace's front yard. The sun had fully cleared the tree line. One of the women in the yard had a camera. She took one shot. Toya Mercer, 28, standing in the doorway of Mercer Works in her grandfather's front yard, the green plaid thermos visible on the workbench behind her. 47 women in dress uniform standing at salute in the morning light. That photograph ran in 3 state papers. The caption was 4 words. The interest was ours. Clover Bend, Mississippi, population just under 2,000, had never been on any map that mattered. By the following spring, it would be on several. Horace Mercer came home from the Jackson Rehab Facility on the 15th of June. He was slower, steadier with a cane, his left hand not quite what it had been. Toya drove him herself. When they pulled down Route 9, she watched his face. He saw the new sign, Mercer Works, hand-forged iron letters, mounted above the original painted wood, both preserved side by side. And his jaw worked for a moment without words. He said, "Somebody fixed my sign." Toya said, "Somebody fixed a lot of things." He looked at the 4 service bays, the updated electrical, the workshop walls stripped and reinforced and painted the same color they had always been. Then he went inside and stood in front of his workbench under glass and his photograph from 1969 and the green plaid thermos, and he put one hand flat on the glass and was very quiet for a long time. Finally he said, "Baby girl, what did you do?" Toya said, "What you taught me." The Horace and Toya Mercer Fellowship awarded its first 3 grants that fall. One to a 24-year-old Marine veteran from Natchez. One to a 31-year-old Army medic from Hattiesburg who wanted to study electrical systems. One to a 26-year-old Air Force loadmaster from a town smaller than Clover Bend who had been told, twice, that she wasn't built for engineering. They all were. Dale Hubbard from Cornerstone Property Solutions called once more, 3 months later, to make what he described as a revised offer. Toya let it go to voicemail. She did not call back. The following week, Cornerstone withdrew its standing offer on 6 other properties in Rankin County and consolidated operations in a different state. Nobody punished them. The math just didn't work anymore. Once honest people started staying. Toya left for Mississippi State on a Tuesday in late August. Horace packed her lunch himself. He put a wrench in the bottom of the bag and said nothing about it, and she didn't ask. And when she found it 2 hours later in her dorm room, she sat on the edge of the bed and held it for a long time. By Thanksgiving, her GPA was 3.89. A professor asked her where she had learned to read a wiring diagram like that. She smiled. "My grandfather, he taught me before I could read a chapter book." She drove home every 3rd weekend. She always spent Saturday morning in the workshop. She changed what needed changing. She kept what needed keeping. She never moved the thermos. Patricia Vance visited in November, stayed 2 nights, ate breakfast at Horace's table. He told her about 1958, the poured foundation, the borrowed mixer. She listened with her notebook in her lap and wrote things down slowly. When she left, she shook his hand with both of hers and said, You started something that didn't stop. Horace smiled. That was the idea. One evening in February of the following year, a storm came up from the Gulf the way Gulf storms do. No warning, just suddenly there and heavy. Toya was home for the weekend. She was alone in the workshop at 10:30 p.m., finishing the timing chain on a neighbor's truck when she heard it. Soft knock at the side door. She opened it. A young woman, maybe 19, soaked through, mascara down her face, pushing a bicycle with a flat rear tire and a snap chain. Her voice was thin. The gas station sent me here. Said you help people when it's late. I can't pay. I just need to get home. Toya looked at the bicycle. She looked at the girl. She stepped back. Come in out of that rain. My grandfather's up. He'll get you something hot. The girl started to cry before she'd even made it through the door. The chain was an 8-minute fix. Toya had the tire patched and inflated in 12 more. She'd worked in silence, the way Horace had taught her. Focus, no performance, just the work. The girl sat on the stool with the cracked vinyl seat and watched. When it was done, the girl pulled out a folded $5 bill. Her hands were shaking. It's all I have. Toya looked at the 5. She shook her head. Keep it. The girl stared at her. Why? Because somebody kept something for me once, and the only way I know how to say thank you is to pass it on. She looked at her. One day somebody you don't owe anything is going to need help. When that happens, you don't ask their price. That's the only payment I take. The girl covered her mouth. She couldn't speak. She nodded. She got on the bicycle and pedaled out into the rain, and Toya watched the single red taillight get small and then disappear around the corner on Route 9. She locked the workshop. She stood in front of Horace's photograph, the photograph from 1969, the raw wood walls, and the grin that said, I told you so to the whole world. She put one hand flat on the glass. I see it now, Grandpa. She turned off the lantern and stepped outside. The rain had stopped. The sky was clearing from the south, the way it does, stars appearing one at a time in the gaps. She stood there a moment, breathing the wet air, before going inside. Horace was in his chair by the window. He'd been watching the road the way old men do when they've lived long enough to know that everything important arrives on ordinary roads on ordinary nights. If you're patient enough to wait for it. He looked up at her. The girl get home okay? She will, Toya said. He nodded. Good. His eyes went back to the road. You did right. She pulled the screen door closed behind her and went in to make coffee. 22 years ago, an old man fixed a stranger's alternator in the dark and wouldn't take the money. 9 days before a deadline that would have ended everything, his granddaughter did the same. And one rainy night in February, the cycle started over again in the hands of a girl on a bicycle who had nothing but a $5 bill and somewhere to be. That's how it works. It always has. You don't break a chain like that. You just make sure the next link holds.